Hey guys, thanks for joining Learn to Play. My name is Lance, and today we're going to take a look at Castle Dice. This was a game that was kickstarted a couple years ago. It's put out by Fun211 Games. It takes roughly 45 minutes to an hour to play, and it is a 2 to 4 player game. In the game, each player is going to be competing against the other players to gain the most victory points by the end of the game. They're going to do this in a number of different ways. At the start of each turn, they're going to collect a number of different dice that will represent the different resources that are available to them. They will roll these dice and put them into a collective pool from all the players. And then, starting with the first player, each player will go around the table and pick one dice and add that to the resources. They will continue doing this until the dice pool is completely depleted, and then they will move into a build phase where they will construct different castle parts that will give them victory points and also other special abilities, as well as constructing different workers, farmers, merchants, and guards to help protect the resources. So let's head to the table and I'll teach you how to play. Let's take a closer look at the player board now. So at the top of the player board you have the animal barn that will hold all the animal tokens that you gather during your turns. And we'll go over the effects of each of these animals later on in the animal section. From there, then you have the barbarian camp, which will hold all your barbarian dice that you happen to roll during your turn. After that, you have the turn order with the 10 steps that will be done during each turn. Then you have the player's resource silo that will hold the player's wood, stone, gold, land, and iron. Along that track, you can see the maximum number you can have for each resource is 9. Then you have a slot for a worker to be placed in each of these sections, and a slot for guards to be placed, which we'll look at both of those closer during their steps. From here you have a slot for the merchants that you happen to hire, which is the max you can have is 3, and their effects that they have during their turn. After that, then you have the farmer section that will hold your farmers that you purchase during your turns. The maximum number of farmers you can have is 3, and their effects based on the number of farmers you have. I'd like to take a quick look at the dice, and as you can see, there's a dice representing each one of the resources in the game. So you have the brown dice being wood, the gray dice being stone, gold dice being gold, green dice being land, and iron dice being red. And each dice has different symbols representing the resources and then some of the animals that you can gather from them, and finally the barbarians. So the top cards are from the castle deck or the gray deck, and the bottom cards are from the village deck or the gold deck. So at the top of each card is going to be the icon that's going to tell you when that card can be used. So these 4 cards here can be used during the build phase of the turn, and these 4 cards here would be used during the gather phase of the turn. Now the 3 that have no symbol on them, they're just regular gather, can be used anytime during the gather turn. And this one that has the first on it means that you would play that before the first time you gather. So with the build cards, some of the cards that are building for castles will give you victory points, and they'll be listed there. On the side of each one of those cards is going to be the resources that you would need to spend to build it. And then some of the cards will also have a lasting effect on them that can affect how your turn goes or what kind of things you'll gain from those cards. On the bottom here you can see the workers that work the same way, and when you build them you would receive a builder token that would be placed on your board. Now on the other side we have the cards that are played during the gather phase, and those are going to have specific effects that they will list on the bottom of each of those cards. Here we have the market cards, and these cards you will gain 1 random 1 when you sell a full set of animals back to the market, and they work the same way as the other cards. At the top corner they will list when the card can be activated, whether it's the build phase or the gather phase, and then on the bottom of the card it will tell you what that card does specifically. For board setup, go ahead and place the turn track board out along with a bead marking the first turn. Each player will go ahead and get a player board and 5 beads that they'll mark each one of the resources with so they can keep track of their resources during their turns. Next, go ahead and shuffle up the 3 decks: the merchant deck, the village deck, and the castle deck. and place those out so that all players can reach them. From there, you're ready to start the game. We're going to take a closer look at the animal powers now. So you're going to notice there's 4 different animals in the game, and also during the turn order you're going to see that there's pictures of those animals, and that's going to help you to identify when you can use those animals. So the first one we're going to look at is the horse, and the player that has the most horse tokens will get to be the first player to go each turn. After that we have the chicken, and the player that has the most chicken tokens will get their hand size increased from 5 cards to 6 cards. After that we have cows, so the player that has the most cows can change one of his villagers, which would be a worker, farmer, merchant, or guard, to any other type after choosing which dice to roll during the turn. So during step 3, after you've chosen your dice, you get to move one of your villagers to another spot. Now do keep in mind that you have to follow the specific rules for those particular workers. So let's go ahead and say that we have a couple of workers, a merchant, and a guard. We can choose to move one of these guys to another space of our choosing. If we choose to take the merchant away, we could add him to one of our workers, but we have to follow the order. We can't just choose to drop him here because the workers have to be placed in order. So he would have to be placed there, or we could make him a guard or a farmer, just depending upon our needs. The last one we have to look at is the pig, and the player that has the most pigs gets to do what's called a pork chop once during his turn. A pork chop will let that player, when he's collecting dice resources, change one dice to any other symbol on that dice. One thing to keep in mind though is once that player does that and receives those resources, he passes for the rest of the collection. So you want to hold on to that until the end, or if there's a resource you really need, because once you're done with it, then you're out of the collecting. One other thing to keep in mind is that the pig only grants 1 pork chop a turn. So if a player loses the most pigs during that turn and hasn't used it yet, the player that picks up those pigs will be able to use it. And vice versa. If the player used the pigs and then loses them, the next player that gets them will not be able to use them during that same turn. Now we're going to take a closer look at villager powers. Villagers cover workers, guards, merchants, and farmers. So the first thing we're going to look at is workers. So during step 7, when the workers produce, they will produce 1 additional resource of whatever spot that they're on. Now when you build workers, you have to build workers from the top down. So you'd have to start with wood, and then if you get another worker, then he would go to stone, golds, lands, and finally to iron. So you wouldn't be allowed to build a land worker before you built a wood worker. It has to be placed in the row. Now the next one we look at is the guard, who is going to protect the resource that they are assigned to from barbarian raids. And with guards, you can pick any one that you want when you build one. So you could place them on the stone first or iron. With that, there is no regulations on which one you can build first. The next one we're going to look at are merchants. You can build up to 3 merchants during the game, and with merchants what they let you do is discard 1 resource to add 1 resource of 1 level rarer. So let's go ahead and say, for example, we have 1 stone. We can choose to discard the stone to gain 1 gold, because it's the next resource down the line. And if we would have had a second merchant for per se, we could exchange 1 gold for 1 land. So for each merchant, you're allowed to do this 1 time during the turn. And if we had a third merchant, we could change the 1 land for an iron. Now you can never go backwards, so we couldn't exchange an iron for a land. Now the last worker type we're going to look at are the farmers. And again, it's going to depend on how many farmers you have, and each result is going to be listed on those spaces. So if you have 1 farmer, you can collect 1 additional animal of the type that you collect. So if per se you selected a pig during your turn, you would gain 2 pigs instead. Now if you have 2 farmers, you can collect an additional animal of any type. So if you would have chosen the pig, then you could also choose one additional animal on top of the pig. And the third type is if you have 3 farmers and you can collect 2 of any type of animal instead of what you've gathered. So you can choose any of the 4 animals to take 2 of instead. Castle dice is played over 7 turns, as you can see on the turn track here, and each turn has a total of 10 steps that are followed in order. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at each one of these steps now. So the first one is to determine who goes first. At the beginning of the game, this is determined by each player receiving 2 wood dice and rolling them. The player that rolls the most wood will be the first player to go. So player 1 has rolled 1 wood, where player 2 has rolled 3 wood. So player 2 will be the first player to go this turn. In subsequent turns, it'll be the player that has the most horse tokens, and if no player has the most horse tokens, then the player to the left of the player that went first the previous turn will be the first to go. So let's say that player 2 is the first player this turn. In turn 2, if nobody has horses or nobody has the most horses, then player 1 will be the first one to go, as he is the player to that player's left. The second step is to choose and draw cards in order. So before they do this, each player will discard any cards in their hand that they don't want to use anymore. From there, starting with the first player, each player will draw back up to their starting hand size of 5 cards, unless of course they have the most chickens, in which case their hand size will be increased to 6. Other than that, each player will tell the players how many cards they're drawing out of each of the deck, the village deck and the castle deck, before they draw them. So starting with our first player, he's going to go ahead and take 4 village cards and 1 castle card. And then the next player is going to go ahead and take 2 castle cards and 3 village cards. In step 3, players pick choice dice. So the first thing we're going to do is reference the turn, and each player will receive the dice that are listed in that turn section. After that, then we'll reference the blue cube section, which will tell us how many choice dice each player will get. So starting with our first player, they will tell the player that's controlling the bank which dice colors they would like. So that player is going to go ahead and take an extra gold and a land dice, and then player 2 is going to select an extra stone and a land dice. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the dice are limited, so if there aren't any dice left in the bank of that particular color, the player cannot choose those dice as their choice dice. In step 4, all dice are rolled and the world is formed. So each player will gather up their dice and go ahead and roll them. If the players roll any Vikings, those are added to their Viking camp for that player. And then the dice can be separated into the different colors if you choose. In step 5, the players are going to go ahead and gather resources in order until all of the resources are gone. So starting with the first player, he's going to choose one of the resource dice, remove it and add it back to the bank, and add that resource onto his track. So he's going to go ahead and take 3 wood and add 3 wood to his track. Then we'll move over to player 2, who's going to go ahead and choose to play a card, which you can play any card that has a hand icon on it. So he's going to play the Wise Grandfather, which it says, play before you gather 1 extra time this round. After you've collected the resources from both of your gatherings, roll these 2 dice back into the world. So he's going to go ahead and take 3 wood and a land. And then he goes ahead and rolls these back into the field. So now we have that. That card is discarded, and it goes back to player 1, who's going to go ahead and take 2 wood. Back to player 2, who's going to take a gold. Player 1 is going to go ahead and take a stone. Player 2 is going to go ahead and take a horse because he wants to be the first player to go next turn. Player 1 is going to go ahead and take another stone. Player 2 is going to go ahead and take a wood. Player 1 is going to go ahead and take some gold. Player 2 is going to go ahead and take some chickens. So he'll add a chicken dice to his card. Player 1 is going to go ahead and take a chicken as well. And player 2 will take the pig. Moving on to step 6, go to the market, starting clockwise order. So each player will go ahead and look at the animals that they have in their animal barn, and they can choose during this turn to trade in a full set of all 4 animals to get 1 market card. Now, one thing to keep in mind, during turns 3, 5, and 7, players must turn in all complete sets of animals for market cards. They do not have a choice during those turns. So player 2 almost had a full set if he would have been able to get a cow, and he could have chosen to trade that in for 1 market card. And as we went over earlier, the market cards will give you different effects that you can use during your turns, or just victory points. Moving on to step 7, workers produce. So during this step, if any of the players have workers in any of the 5 different resources, those workers will produce 1 more of that resource. So let's go ahead and put a couple out here just so we can see what happens. So we'll say the player 1 has a worker in wood and stone, and player 2 only has a worker in wood. So during this step, each spot will go up 1 space. So player 1 will gain a wood and a stone, and player 2 will gain a wood. Moving on to step 8, merchants work. During this step, if any players have any merchants in their merchant section, they can choose to discard a resource to gain a resource 1 level higher. You may do this 1 time for each merchant you have. In step 9, we go ahead and build any of the cards that we have in our hands with the resources that each player has in their silos. This step can be done simultaneously by all players. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of this. So player 1 will go ahead and flip over his cards so you guys can see what he has. So he has a worker and a guard, a couple of king's messengers, and an alchemist. So let's go ahead and try to build a guard. So he costs 2 wood. So we'll go ahead and decrease our wood by 2. We go ahead and discard his card, and we go ahead and get a worker that will represent one of our guards. We can place the worker in any of the guard slots. So let's go ahead and place it in our stone slots, let's go wood. From here, we can choose to also build the worker if we have the resources for him. So he'll cost 1 wood and 2 stone. Now, workers are a little bit different in that they have to be placed in the topmost slot and then work their way down. So the first worker has to be placed in wood. The next worker would be placed in stone, then gold, land, and finally iron. So with that, we don't have anything else to build for him. So let's go ahead and take a look at player 2. So player 2 also has a guard and a farmer, plus a couple of castle parts, but he doesn't have the resources for either one of those. So let's go ahead and build a farmer. So it costs 2 wood and a land, and we can go ahead and place a farmer icon down there. And then he's also going to build a guard, which is going to cost 2 wood. And then he's going to go ahead and place a guard in his gold slot since he has 1 gold. The final step in a round is the Barbarian's Raid. So for each Barbarian dice you have in the Barbarian camp, it's going to decrease all of the resources that you have by 1 value for each dice. So if player 2 has 1 Barbarian, so he would decrease each one of his resources by 1, except for the resources that are guarded by guards. So he doesn't have any resources in any of the 4 values. He has 1 resource in gold, but it is guarded, so he won't lose any points there. And the Barbarian dice is discarded. Now player 1 has 2 Barbarians, so he's going to lose 2 resources from each resource slot except for slots that are guarded. So his wood is guarded, but his gold is not. So he will lose all the resources he has in that, and then those dice are discarded. After that, then the players will move to turn B to the next turn. So we'll move from turn 1 to turn 2, and then we can go ahead and start at the top of the order again. After the players completed round 7, then the last thing to do is to do the final scoring. So the first thing we do is count up the number of animals that each player has, and the player with the most animals will receive 1 victory point. So player 2 has 6 animals, and player 1 has 4. So player 2 will gain 1 victory point for animals. After that, then the player with the most villagers will gain 1 victory point. So player 1 has a total of 11, and player 2 has a total of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So both players tied, and when players tie, then neither player will get any victory points for that. And then each player that has a bard will receive 1 victory point for each bard. Player 2 has 1 bard, so he will receive 1 victory point for him. And then finally, players will total up the number of victory points that they have for each of their buildings. So player 2 will have a total of 2 victory points for his deep moat and 1 for the royal chambers for 3, plus his 1 for his animals for 4 and 1 for the bard for 5. Player 1 will have 2 victory points from his gatehouse and 4 from his tall keep for a total of 6. So at this point, player 1 has won the game with 6 victory points versus player 2 that had 5. If at this point the players would have tied at 6 points apiece, then the player that has the most iron would be the winner. If tied there, then they would move to lands, gold, stone, and finally wood, if needed.